Many changes took place in Buddhism in the centuries after the Buddha preached the sermons of enlightenment. Some of these are evidenced by the bizarre cultural mix that exists at Sarnath today. The Dhammek Stupa, where the Buddha preached his first sermon, is worshipped by Buddhists from far and wide through different rituals. Next to them are devout Hindus praying to their own gods. This gradual transformation of Buddhism is exemplified at Nalanda, originally one of the great seats of Buddhist scholarship.
Legend has it that even the gatekeepers of Nalanda were great scholars. They would examine candidates who applied for admission, and only when the candidates passed the examination set by the gatekeepers that they were allowed to enter the university. And of course, once they entered the university, there were the whole series of discourses, debates, discussions that they had to go through. And those who did well in those were honored with silken robes, were mounted on elephants, and were honored in every other way. One wonders if the great Buddha himself had entered this university with his begging bowl and in his tattered robes, whether he would have been at all allowed. For after all, Nalanda represents at one level the best in Buddhism. But barely 1,000 years after the Buddha, it had also degenerated into a kind of a feudal setting where the monasteries were sustained by the exactions from the peasants and their lands, and the monks themselves led a very unproductive life.
The pure doctrine had been covered by rank growths, just as the pristine rules of monastic poverty and simplicity had been superseded. Miracles had been derided by the Buddha, but became the mainstay of the religion, so that reports of supernatural feats by many Buddhas proliferated. Primitive fertility rites reappeared in the form of Tantrism and penetrated Buddhist, Jain and Brahmin theology. Even animal sacrifice started being carried out near the seats of religions that were based on ahimsa. The growth of the Buddhist institutions is seen in the establishment of cave monasteries. Over time, these caves came to reflect the changes that the doctrine underwent. The most significant change was the split of the Buddhist Sangha into two sects, the more orthodox Hinayana and the more adaptable Mahayana. In the Hinayana school, the Buddha was represented through symbols like the stupa. The Buddha was worshipped in his human form by the followers of Mahayana.
ये हिनायन और महायान दो पंथ है, हिनायन और महायान, ये दो पंथ है अजंता में. जो हिनायन वहां स्तूप रहेगा, महायान वहां मूर्ति रहेगा. ऐसे दो पंथी है. तो ये दोनों भी पंथ आपने 19 नंबर में देखा है, जो स्तूप के अलावा मूर्ति भी है.
A prominent section of the original Buddhist discipline lays stress upon the disgusting and filthy constituents of the human body. The monk had regularly to meditate detail by detail upon the loathsome inner components of his own physical being. But no one would ever guess this from the finest specimens of Buddhist art. The multitude of diademed bodhisattvas and handsome couples stretch from Gandhar in the north to Ajanta in the Deccan. No rotting corpse, no leprous beggar mars the smooth harmony of sumptuous frescoes and reliefs to remind the monk of the founder's doctrine. The art does not portray the normal hardships of the poorest villager, whose misery was easily discounted on the callous theory that he probably deserved the suffering because of misdeeds in some previous birth. Even the Rigvedic war hero and god, Indra, was made into a respectful hearer of the original Buddhist discourses. Like the Jains, the Mahayana too admitted a whole new pantheon of gods. The Buddha, of course, remained above all the rest as a super-god in a heaven of his own. But the number of past Buddhas was multiplied beyond limit. A future messianic Buddha, Maitreya, was added. As this painting at Ajanta shows, many popular folklore tales were adopted as Jataka stories of the former births through which the Buddha had perfected himself. Every branch of the doctrine, every new monastic rule was justified by writing in a new story about the Buddha. At the same time, relics of the Buddha's mortal body, worshipped everywhere, grew in size and quantity till they would have done credit to a whole troop of elephants. But the Brahmins played this game of numbers much better. The gods the Brahmins wrote into their Puranas rose both in numbers as well as in high worship. By this time, the Buddhist Sangha and the state were coming to terms. The Buddha was turned into the spiritual counterpart of the temporal Chakravartin emperor. However, even under Ashoka the Great, Buddhism never became a state religion, nor did it use the state machinery for the suppression of any rival doctrine. From the very beginning, the Sangha contained Brahmins who might have renounced caste but retained their intellectual traditions. There was give and take between the two streams of thought. The current Brahmin ideology was often taken for granted, just as the Brahmins had given up beef eating and accepted ahimsa as their main ideal. Slowly, the higher philosophies of both Buddhists and Brahmins began to converge, and the Buddha was included in the pantheon of Brahmanical deities. Ironically, this convergence was carried out best by Shankara, the great Brahmanical reformer, who is said to have started his crusading journey from this place in Kerala. Neither Buddhism nor Shankara's Dharma believed that the material world was real. By the time Shankara began attacking Buddhism, it had changed so much that there was little difference between his ideas and those he was criticizing. It is difficult today to grasp just what the controversy was about, for the difference between the protagonists seems negligible in content, if not in form. The effect of Buddhism on the realities of political life was also waning. Ashoka had turned to the non-killing religion after a single gruesome battle fought at the spot in Kalinga. However, later kings, who also passed for good Buddhists, waged ferocious wars and carried out the massacre of innocents without any qualms of conscience. No Buddhist king, however, killed or crusaded for the glory or propagation of religion. The state support that Ashoka had given to Buddhism continued in varying measure till the end of the 12th century. The Kushana kings, like Kanishka, who is depicted through this famous statue at Mathura, ushered in a new era of magnificent donations, which gave a secure base for Mahayana Buddhism. The Shungas, the immediate successors of the Mauryans, are however said to have favored Brahmins. The first Shunga king, Pushyamitra, celebrated a horse sacrifice or yajna. The Ashwamedha is said to have been carried out at this ghat in Varanasi.
There is a belief that Varanasi is the oldest living city in India. There is not much point indulging in competitive urban antiquity, but the fact is that Varanasi was already a thriving commercial center in the time of the Buddha. It was already a center for weaving. But much more than weaving and other types of commerce, what was most important in the case of Banaras, then as now, has been religion. Religion was so important to the life of the city that every activity revolved around that. And this religious activity basically focused on three aspects: bathing in the river, thereby purification by water; performing fire sacrifices, that is all kinds of yajnas; performing animal sacrifices, including the famous horse sacrifice. The ghat opposite is called the Dasaswamed Ghat, where 10 horse sacrifices are supposed to have been performed, and other types of ritual which went with the religion as it evolved. Now the Buddha, for instance, was against such ritualism, which is why he was perhaps never very welcome in Banaras as such. He preached his sermons at Sarnath, a little distance away, and by and large kept away from the city.
Brahmanical rituals continued in spite of the Buddha, although the criticism advanced by Buddhism and other Shramanic schools of thought did affect their popularity. The performance of this Soma Yajna at Vidisha is evidence of the recent attempts to reinvigorate Vedic ritualism. However, such revival of Brahmanical practices as took place under the Shungas had practically no adverse effect upon Buddhism. The Shungas themselves continued to patronize the Sangha generously, often by embellishing stupas, such as this one at Sanchi. Later, in the 4th century, the Guptas cited the Mahabharata in the land grants that they made to Brahmins. At the same time, Buddhist monasteries too were renovated and their stipends increased. This Gupta temple at Sanchi is an example of the coexistence of Buddhism and what developed into Hinduism. The first real persecution of Buddhism came in the 7th century with King Narendragupta Shashanka of Bengal, who raided deep into the Gangetic plain. He destroyed many Buddha images and cut down the Bodhi tree at Gaya. The existing tree is a distant descendant of the original. Shashank's contemporary, King Harsh of Kannauj, temporarily restored the fortunes of the Sangha. But when Huan Sang, the famous Chinese traveler, came to study at Nalanda, the changed state of Buddhism was obvious to him.
These were the kind of rooms in which the scholars of Nalanda used to live, single-bedded, hard, and today it gives an impression of a degree of sparseness and austerity. But it was not always like that. Huan Sang, who visited the university in the 7th century AD, describes the place. He says the monks' dwellings in all the courtyards had 4 stories. The beams were painted with the colors of the rainbow and were carved with animal designs, while the pillars were red and green. In India there were thousands of monasteries, he said, but none surpassed this one in magnificence and sublimity. Always present were 10,000 monks, including hosts and guests. These people, the monks, used to study, of course, Buddhism, but also worldly books such as the Vedas and other classics. They also studied grammar, medicine and mathematics. The king gave them the revenue of more than 100 villages to support them, and each of the villages had 200 families who daily offered them several hundred tan of rice, butter and milk. Thus, the students could have 4 requisites: clothing, food, shelter and medicine, sufficient for their needs without going to beg for them. One wonders how this kind of living tied up with the Buddhist prescription to monks to go out and beg, and not only to go and beg in particular houses, but to go and beg in the first few houses in any street. The idea was that the monks should not develop a taste for particular types of food. Hence, the Buddha prescribed only one begging bowl into which all food had to be put, and then the monk would give up the sense of taste, one of the many attachments which tie people down to this world.
Yuan Sang had been uneasy about the survival of Nalanda. His nightmare of its bitter end came true when the great monastery was sacked and burnt down in the general disorder after the death of Harsha. The Senas, unquestionably Hindu kings in the modern sense of the word, continued the donations and had to fortify the monasteries built by their predecessors, the Palas. They did this in order to protect the monastic treasures from brigands. This only led to the buildings being stormed and sacked all the more thoroughly by a handful of raiders under Muhammad bin Bakhtiyar Khilji, who swept through Magad and Bengal about AD 1200. Today, if Nalanda is still famous, it is in a completely different context.
इंतजार के एक पल का बदला लूंगा ऐसा भी क्या ये न समझना आज भी ऐसे जाने दूंगा ऐसा भी क्या कितना सताया पहले उसका हिसाब.
Much earlier, Ashok had carried out most of the duties recommended by the Buddha for a monarch, especially in the field of public works. However, he left out one important task: the provision of merchant capital. The monasteries later amply fulfilled this requirement. The accumulated monastic wealth was used by early merchants and caravaneers. The Deccan cave monasteries in particular lay handy to the trade routes. These ran from the western harbours like Kalyan and Thani through the well-marked passes that led up to the plateau. The influence of merchants and money in the monasteries even found expression in the art and architecture of the caves. This monastery at Karale in western India dates back to an austere pre-Ashokan era, but the sculpture is voluptuous, of handsome couples dressed in the height of style, hardly what one would expect in an assembly place for monks, but precisely what rich merchants would have liked. The artists must have been specially brought from some distance and employed at considerable expense. Moreover, the whole complex took a few centuries to complete, but has an overall artistic unity, implying a continuity of design, finance, and administration. The connection with merchants and bankers from many distant places is obvious from the names of donors inscribed on various pillars, statues, and caves which they donated. There were many other donors, some of them unexpected. Guilds of craftsmen and artisans appear in the records of some monasteries, not only as generous donors, but also as prestigious investors. There are also individual donors: scribe, physician, the wife of a ploughman, and mother of a household farmer, and so on. Today, no artisan or worker of this sort could be expected to make enough money to donate anything important in normal Indian village life.
Buddha
रखे तस्मातरे अमाहे अस्यायाम बोध सत्व प्रतिथापितो। इसका आशय है बुद्धरक्षित नाम के भिक्षु ने अपने माता पिता के संपूजनार्थ सुख विहार में बोधिसत्व की प्रतिमा सबके सुख के लिए प्रतिष्ठापित की।
Some of the recorded gifts, like this image of the Buddha, now in the Mathura Museum, are remarkably enough made by monks or nuns. The very fact that they had the money to give shows that the resolutions on austerity and simplicity had been openly flouted or quietly suspended. In the beginning, the entrant into the Sangha had first to distribute all his worldly possessions and then renounced the worldly life. Later, he brought his money and experience of money-making into the monastery. Some of the cells in the viharas had inner compartments without light or ventilation, which could only have been meant for the safekeeping of precious goods. This indicates the presence of substantial wealth, and monasteries could well have doubled up as the banks of those days.
There was a problem in the structural relationship between the Sangha and the lay world. Even at the point of origin, the Sangha is regarded as a fairly comfortable institution, and we have very interesting references to the fact that some people actually joined the Sangha in order to escape from a life of drudgery. So it's that there was relative comfort in the Sangha is even discussed and described in the early Buddhist texts.
The monasteries were important customers for the caravans of merchants. The monks bought cloth for themselves, incense and costly perfumes for the service, metal images and lamps. It is also obvious that these abbeys were important stages on the journey, resting places for the caravaneers, as well as supply houses and banks. From about the 6th century AD, the passes were guarded by forts, which were a feature of the emerging feudal landscape. Their ostensible duty was protection of kingdom and travellers, but all they really accomplished was collection of tolls from the caravans. The system of mercantile monasteries passed away when Buddhism became a drain upon the economy instead of a stimulus. Regional barter in essential items began to predominate over the long-distance and overseas trade. The newly developed villages and towns found the remotely situated monasteries inconvenient for trade and finance on a large scale. The long caravans of traders gradually dwindled to groups of banjaras, which still exist. In fact, the Banjara name is derived from Vanijakar, meaning merchant. The powerful guilds were broken up and they shrank to miserable caste groups of producers who travelled for meagre gain from place to place, as some of them still do. Overall production increased, but commodity production per head and long-distance trade both declined. And instead of aiding intensive commodity exchange, coins were turned into jewelry and metals in other forms fell out of circulation, frozen as idols.
There is a case of a king, Harsh of Kashmir, who is supposed to have destroyed a large number of temples and taken the idols out and melted it for the metal. Why did he do so? Political economy and history have one thing in common, that is the use of metals. Often very large amounts of metals are stored inside religious institutions, and kings required that metal for purposes of war and otherwise. Therefore, kings have attacked religious institutions and taken the metal out. It is well known that King Henry VIII of England took the plate which was stored in cathedrals and churches and melted it. It is known that the Chinese emperors at one time had banned the use of metals in carving of idols. Harsh of Kashmir was not a vandal. He was a man of culture. He liked poetry and he patronized various religions. Nevertheless, he appointed a special minister at one point whose job was to go and defile those idols and take the metal out and melt it. Why did he need to do so? He needed the metal in order to fight the feudatory barons who were attacking him. And metal in the hands of the king was much more important than metal in the temples.
The monasteries had to go, but their mark was not erased. The ancient mother goddesses whose primordial cults had been displaced by Buddhism sometimes returned to the identical spot. The Buddhist stupa on the ruins of Mohenjo-daro is not an accident of our history. Similarly, various Buddhist sites have also been appropriated. At Karle, the great stone stupa is identified with the goddess Yamai, but the blood sacrifices to the goddess at this Buddhist site is now largely symbolic. The memory of the Sangha has largely faded, and today visitors to even as grand a Buddhist monument as Ajanta remain vague about its history.
फैशन वो बताते सब पुरातन काल की लेडीज जेंट्स सब राजा महाराजा की.
ये तो पुराना ही है, जो मतलब पुराने लोगों ने इसका जो ये करा ना, तो उसमें कुछ उनकी मालूमात होंगी, अपन तो इतना कोई जानते नहीं.
गुफा अच्छा है, गुफा बढ़िया है, बहुत सारे टूरिस्ट लोग भी आते हैं.
However, even as the Sangha died, Buddhism itself continued to live in different cultures. Indeed, the teachings of the Buddha are once again providing solace in these turbulent times.